So it's my very pleasure to introduce Paola Tubaro, and hope this is the connection is actually working. Paola is from the University of Greenwich. She's both a sociologist and an economist. I thought it would be very important to start this workshop not with some view only coming from the technical side or the computer. I mean, as we have like a sociology workshop in the first place. She's been doing very interesting work on a various number of topics, but including in particular the riot in London. And so today she's going to talk about valuing sociology in times of unrest, social simulation experiment in the UK riots. So please welcome Paola Tubaro.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Frederic, for organizing this workshop, because I really feel we are all engaged in this new way of doing our research in a way or another, but we perhaps needed a moment to stop and think about it in a more methodological way. What are we doing? What's the value? What are the what is the value added and the limitations of what we are doing, and what are the different ways of doing just-in-time sociology and just-in-time research in general. So I'm very glad to be here. And my plan for today was just to share with you my own experience with just-in-time research, which basically started with a study we undertook during the riots in the UK last year. So you may all remember these images, and actually I was, at that time, it was beginning of August 2011, I was at the beach in southern Portugal, and suddenly in the evening coming back to the hotel, seeing that, it was like, oh my God, what's happening at home while I'm away? So the very first reaction was, of course, well, being scared, thinking about the people I knew in London, my colleagues who were perhaps still there at that moment. Let's hope they are safe. And looking at emails from my university that were people giving instructions for safety, do this, do that, don't go, you know, kind of scared. But then, in this context of uneasiness overall, what came out very quickly was a sort of attack of the sociology in particular, but the social sciences more generally. And in fact, the first reaction of key politicians, our beloved Mayor of London, who said explicitly, and in the same speech he said it twice, we don't want sociological explanations here, we want to put these criminals in jail, basically. And similar views were expressed by others, like the police chairman, but others too. So social scientists felt like under attack at this moment. Are we those who are justifying criminality because of unemployment, poverty, whatever, inequalities? And the British Sociological Association reacted immediately with an open letter to the Guardian saying that, well, no, you are wrong, you can't explain crime just like that. Crime is a social, they were talking especially about the looting and the disorder rather than the more protest aspect itself, and saying that there's a lot of social aspect in that. You need to get the help of sociologists to sort it out. And they offered help to the Mayor of London by other sociologists. The problem, I mean, okay, I appreciate that, but my problem personally was fine, but how? Because after all, I felt personally that Boris and all the other politicians weren't completely wrong in like feeling that old explanations based on inequality, unemployment, poverty, and the like were insufficient, you don't riot just because you are unemployed or just because you are poor. And many of the people who were unemployed at the time didn't riot, didn't participate. So it's clearly not enough. At the same time, I mean, as Frederick said, I'm an economist by background, and what economists would say here is you make very rational cost-benefit calculations, what's the probability and the discomfort of arrest against what's the pleasure or gain or whatever from getting like a new TV from a looted store, things like that, and then you balance the two and you make your decision, which also sounds, well, not totally convincing. In fact, what social science research and even economics research has brought out in previous cases of riots very clearly is that what we have here is a mix of individual and community factors, and perhaps there are individual motivations, and perhaps there are factors such as perceived inequality or frustration from being unemployed and the like, but then there's a complex chain of social influences and events that bring this own individual, one's own individual frustration into active action, participation in a mass protest or a riot or a looting. So how does this chain work, in fact? It's not easy to say. And of course, you can't have, again, economists would want to have all the time the best possible data ever, so something that could be comparable to experiments, where you have your control group and your treatment group and see what the difference is. Of course, you can't induce an experimental riot. You can't do anything like that, so you don't have such data, and all that you have are approximations. And on top of that, at the time of the UK riots, I mean, at the beginning of August 2011, we didn't even have low-quality data. We didn't even have surveys or just figures from arrests. This came later. It was too early. So how do we do that? And the other complication was the debate at that precise moment that came out in the press on whether or to what extent the use of online social networks, Twitter and Facebook, but especially there was a lot of talk about the BlackBerry Messenger system in the UK case, and whether this would have contributed to fuel the riots, to, as I said before, channel these individual motivations into collective action, or perhaps to even channel influences towards people by involving, in fact, people who wouldn't be as motivated to participate by just themselves in the mass movement. And very clearly, sort of ambiguity appeared in public debates, because there had been a lot of talk of how in the Arab Spring, just a few months before, Facebook and Twitter had helped bring about democracy and liberty and freedom, or all these nice things, while in fact in London that became an instrument of the devil to promote looting and very bad things. So even the Prime Minister, who had praised the renewal, had been the first to visit Egypt after the fall of the Mubarak regime, he was wondering very seriously whether it would make sense to shut the internet or some services, or perhaps some specific social media, to stop the violence. So the question was really, okay, we don't know if it's possible technically to do so. In the end, Cameroon didn't do that. That wasn't done in the UK, but it was considered. And it wasn't clear at the moment whether legally that would be possible, whether technically that would be feasible. But let's assume it is. Would it work? Would it stop the violence? Because that's in the end what the policymakers wanted, in fact. And that wasn't something completely clear just from just from start. So how to answer this question, which is complex? In that situation, in fact, and I was working at that with Antonio, who is also here, our first discussions into how can we contribute something to these unclear debates was to perhaps let's start with something that is more theoretical than empirical, given that we don't have data of any kind, good or bad. Perhaps we can ourselves use social media to, well, engage into discussions that can help us refine our theoretical starting point, and maybe at least start here preparing some basis for future work that might refine that at a later stage. So what we did is we worked kind of 36 hours in a row, day and night, to get a first draft of something, which came out as a joint blog post on our respective blogs together, exactly the same. And in fact, we used Twitter to tell the people who knew about it, and we were very pleased that we got a lot of comments and reactions, and many people who contributed ideas, bits of code, comments, or some witness descriptions about things at work in some specific cases. So we could make improvements, and within another 3 days, we managed to have a sort of mini paper which had more or less the structure of a scientific paper, and that we just released on the SSRN network, so as a working paper, in fact, for everyone to download a little bit less, how can I say, for a general public than a blog post, but still more scientific in style. And that also helped, in fact, get further comments and feedback from others. And then afterward, actually, we managed to transform it into a more classical article that came out as a normal publication 1 year later. It was just this last July. So this is just a couple of images for our blogs, and some of the networks, in fact, that took up our ideas and translated them into French. These are others. That was mostly the blogosphere. The attention from the press came later, in fact, toward end of August rather than mid-August at the very beginning. So how did we manage, in fact, to do something? Our approach was, well, of course, it's not the only possible solution, but it's how we found a way to contribute, and we used, in the absence of data and wanting to do something theoretical, we used computer simulation, with the idea that computer simulation can serve as an aid for a thought experiment, in a sense. So what we cannot experiment in reality, we can do in silico on a virtual, in fact, context that can help us detect some key factors that might be at stake in the situation under study and draw some conclusions. So, in fact, we grew an artificial riot on the computer in the absence of a possibility to do it in reality. So the first step when you build a simulation model is you need to define a population of agents. The jargon is agents, say, well, those who will interact in the context of interest and produce some social outcome that you want to describe. The population, who is our population? Well, if you looked at the media, there were just two kinds of individuals or people, the looters and the heroes. There was all this discourse of community heroes, which sometimes went very far, as far as I'm concerned. Some heroes were human, of course. But anyway, that seemed a little bit too simplistic. So we actually, after some first observations of what we ourselves could see or our friends in London could tell us, and what we read in the newspapers and what other people through the blogosphere told us, we basically defined a population that is still very simplistic, but perhaps better adapted to describe what we wanted to describe. We are in fact citizens, normal people, who may or may not become active, so engage in the protest or riot. There's the police around, of course, and you may be arrested, of course, if you participate in the protest. It's still very simplistic, very basic. But what we found interesting here is that we didn't distinguish, in principle, the citizens into two categories, the good and the bad. We just allowed them to decide at each step, and given the social context and the circumstances, whether or not to engage in the rioting or to stay peaceful and perhaps engage in more constructive activities, as we would say. So that was still a little bit more open, even though still simplistic. In the model, you have to then, once you have your agents, you have to define how they behave, what do they do. And again, what you usually do is define rules that are very, very basic, but at the individual level, but that when you interact the agents together, in fact, can produce complex patterns. So our citizens start with different levels of grievance towards the government. They may or may not like it. They may or may not be satisfied. That depends on their personal circumstances, of course, and can vary from an agent to another. Some of them may decide to become active, so they turn from yellow to red. And that depends on how unhappy they are, their level of grievance, and also on their social surroundings. That is, do they see around them the example of others who are also active and who might induce them to join the protest? It's well known that some people who may not start a protest or riot may still join it when it already is in place. And it also depends on whether there's police around them. So what's the perceived risk of being arrested and paying the consequences of action. We implemented the police as, again, with a very, very simple rule. They look around, and if they see someone who is active, they can pick up one of them randomly and arrest it, which is a way of representing the fact that the police, of course, is powerful, but not as powerful as being able to arrest all the actives all the time. It's still costly and requires a lot of effort on their part to do so. So they get some, but not all. And the randomness is to allow for a variety of individual circumstances that are, in fact, unobserved in the model. So then, once we have the population, we have the agents with their rules of behavior, then we had to create a social dynamics. So we placed them, all our agents, the citizens and the police at the beginning, in a common environment. Well, technically it's a grid, but we can interpret it as a city or a neighborhood. And you just let them interact over time. So they may decide to go active. We see some red here. They can move around. Some of them will get arrested, and that's the black ones. And that continues for some time. Each agent, in fact, may move around and change its status, so from quiet citizen to active citizen to jailed to quiet again, and so on and so forth. What we do is observe then the systemic outcomes at the end, when the system has stabilized into some configuration that more or less stays the same all the time. So as you can see, in fact, agents may move around, create areas where they're much more concentrated than others. That is something that is allowed to vary, and we observe what happens at the end. This model, in fact, is a refinement on a pre-existing one, which was the model of civil violence of Joshua Epstein, published in 2002. And in fact, our key innovation with respect to the original model is on the interpretation of a parameter that was called vision. And vision is something that we interpreted and we changed the model in this respect. In fact, it's something that we interpreted as the ability of an agent to scan their environment, their neighborhood, and to see if there are, well, the factors that can prompt the agent to action, so either other actives or police. And so they can see what is around them and move to places where, if they want to become more active, in particular, where there are other people who are, a concentration of other people who are active too. So vision, in fact, is the variable that determines the ability of the agent to scan their environment. It can be limited to just its own surroundings or wider, and allowing the agent to see more around it. So, you know, how far the agent is able to scan the situation, decide what to do, and decide whether and where to move, depends on vision. And that is something that allowed us to interpret, to get to what we wanted to study with censorship work. That is what allows to interpret censorship as, well, the exactly opposite of vision. So censorship would be limitations to vision. With no censorship, it's like you have maximum vision. You see, you can use, in practice, the interpretation would be you can use your Twitter, your BlackBerry phone, or your Facebook, whatever, to, well, understand what is happening where in London and decide where to move and decide whether to join another group in another part, in another neighborhood or another area of the city. If there is censorship, that means you can't have such a view, you have limitations, so it's as if your vision was reduced. So with partial censorship, you would see just one part of the neighborhood, so something that is perhaps closer to you. And with full censorship, in fact, the agent would only just see its very immediate surroundings, just around him or herself. So that would be doing as if there was no Twitter, no Facebook, no nothing. So censorship is, in fact, restricting vision. And on this basis, we were able, in fact, to study how model outcomes vary with different levels of vision or of censorship, in fact, which is equivalent. So we're able, on this basis, to run a series of virtual experiments, in fact. So running the models for different values of the vision censorship parameter, and then do it for a sufficiently long time and do a sufficient number of repetitions, which we didn't do at the beginning because we didn't have time, but we did later. So to see what happens for each parameter value and compare results at the end. And in fact, what did we discover on this basis? That's basically the essential of our results. So we found that with total censorship, that would mean very limited vision, the number of active agents, the red line there is the number of active agents, in fact, over the whole population over time, over sufficiently long number of time steps to see if the model is stabilized. And we see that with total censorship, the number of active agents goes up very, very quickly at the beginning and stays up all the time, never goes down. So in fact, violence starts and never stops, basically. With partial censorship, so some intermediate level of vision corresponding to a situation in which agents would see some of their surroundings, but not all, we have an intermediate result, that is, violence would go up very quickly at the beginning, then go down and stabilize more or less at some intermediate level. So again, you will always have some degree of violence, but a bit less than if you had total censorship. And with no censorship at all, we find the outcome there at the bottom. So no censorship would be maximum vision, which at the beginning we found a bit striking. What's that? In fact, what we see is that violence goes up at the beginning, as in all cases, then goes down to 0, then goes up again, down to 0, up, down, all the time. Notice, however, that the average, the trend line, is much, much lower than in the other cases. So on average, there's much less violence than when you have either partial or total censorship. You have peaks of violence here and there, but you also have periods, all the time, periods in which there are 0 active agents, so no violence at all. So in fact, you have a very low average, some peaks, and some periods of complete peace, in fact, with no violence at all. So that's a situation that, in fact, is called in the literature punctuated equilibrium. Epstein had discovered that already, of course, so that's something that we took up from him. And at the beginning, we knew nothing, of course, about punctuated equilibrium, even technically, but we then discovered that that's notion that comes from the biological sciences, and that's in opposition to evolutionary theories to say that some processes, and here it's some social processes, are in fact not linear, but evolve through phases, in fact. So in this case, that would be phases of violence alternating with phases of peace. We have a just-in-time bird here. So if we want to get a better, I've reproduced some other graphs to get a better sense of the interpretation of the results. So here we have the average number of active agents for different levels of censorship from total to none. And we have the averages and the interval of variation. And we see it's basically the same as before. That is the average number of active agents, so the average, which can be interpreted as the average level of violence, goes down as the degree of censorship goes down, but there's more variability. Variance is higher. In fact, we can interpret that by saying that when we have low or no censorship, in fact, what happens is that we observe a qualitatively different pattern. Instead of seeing violence going up and staying there, or going up and staying there at a slightly lower level, we see these peaks, these phases of quiet rest and activity all the time. And that's where you can see with no censorship, that's the punctuated equilibrium that is observed. The number of quiet agents, in fact, follows a quite similar, obviously enough, a quite similar trend. So we do have levels of social unrest. Censorship, that means that censorship doesn't eliminate the possibility of violence. We see these peaks. But the system is able to get back to quiet, to peace between peaks, in fact, all the time, which is not true when you have censorship, even partial. Again, that's to confirm the same. The percentage of time spent in quiet with no civil violence, how it varies with vision levels, which I repeat can be interpreted as decreasing censorship. So at the top would be total censorship, at the bottom no censorship. And we see that the time spent in quiet increases. It's actually, there is any time in quiet at all, only for levels of censorship that are very low, so high vision. The other thing that was a comment from someone who said, well, wait a minute, is this just because people get arrested when there is no censorship? Maybe it's also easier if the social media work. It's also easier for the police to get the actives and arrest them more easily. So if you get those periods of peace only because the active people are in jail, well, that's not particularly interesting. And so we looked at that too, because we wanted to check. And in fact, that's not completely true. That's the number of jailed agents. So it was reassuring, in fact, to see that the number of jailed agents goes up when censorship goes down. So it's true that, in fact, with social media, the police is also better able to arrest people. But then, when censorship gets toward none, absence of censorship, then the number of jailed people starts going down again, which means that that's not the main factor explaining the result. It's, in fact, more the self-control of people who get back themselves from activity to quiet that produces the result, and not a higher number of arrests, which in fact, this is even clear in this representation here, where we see again from total censorship to no censorship, the yellow guys are the quiet, the black are the jail, and the red are the actives. We see, as before, that in fact the number of quiet people goes slightly up when censorship gets to its lowest extreme, and the number of jailed people goes down, while the number of actives, in fact, remains low in all the for all the levels of low censorship. In fact, so it's not the activity. It's not increased or improved or facilitated activity by the police that produces the result, but it's something that comes from agents themselves, from citizens themselves, who have a stronger tendency to stay quiet, even when they can influence themselves more or better or more easily through social media. And the interpretation of these results is that the absence of censorship, in fact, channels different types of influences, both active people who may incite others to be active too, but also quiet people who may incite others to be quiet, to stop the violence. And in terms of the interpretation at the time of the riots, I personally would like to relate it to the cleanup initiatives that also started during the riots, and that in fact grew very, very popular quite quickly and involved a lot of people in some sort of civic engagement, which was less destructive than the looting, and in fact consisting in, well, let's be in charge of our streets, of our shops, of our neighborhoods, and do something to get the situation better from the bottom up, really. So this is something that could be explained, I wouldn't say explained, but understood in light of the results of the model too. So the good news, in fact, and I would like to conclude on what I think are the lessons learned from this experience in terms of what just-in-time sociology can offer in general, what are its big advantages and limitations. So the good news is that well, yes, an immediate policy response is possible despite the lack of data and despite the short time available. There's a way of doing things, and social media can help us in getting timely feedback from people as varied as we got a lot of journalists, other bloggers, activists, but also researchers. So we got some technical comments, in fact. Someone who the issue of the jailed people was raised by someone who is also a modeler in Rome, and he also tested some code himself to see if that was true. But so all this is very encouraging, but of course there's a need afterward when things got back to calm to integrate all that into a longer term perspective, theoretically and empirically. So the challenge afterward is how do we build on these first results for something that is more durable in terms of contribution to social science research. Today, in fact, there's more that we know about the riots. There has been, in particular, this series of interviews conducted by a team of researchers at LSE with The Guardian, and they've published already 2 reports on reading the riots, one on the rioters themselves, the other on the police workers who were interviewed afterwards. They stress a lot the social deprivation, inequality issues, in fact, that could have contributed to the discomfort of people and that might have contributed to the riots. So it's mostly about that. The part that I think is most interesting in terms of analysis of data from the riots is the work that Farida did. And, well, it's a shame she couldn't be here today, but she's done all this study of the tweets that were released during the riots, and there are 2 key findings that I think are very interesting. The first, the fact that, if I interpret well, but I think that's what it's in her reports, the most influential Twitter account was Riot Cleanup, and then followed by key journalists or collective accounts by press companies like BBC, Sky News, and the like. And in terms of hashtags, the most popular was, well, of course, London Riot, but then that was immediately followed by different variations on the Riot Cleanup initiatives. So Twitter was mostly used, in fact, for cleanup and media press reports, primarily, rather than by rioters organizing themselves to go loot shops around. So again, that provides further evidence that, at least in the case of Twitter, censorship wouldn't really have been justified, because that would have stopped the cleanups and the press much more than the rioters themselves. What we did afterward, well, we struggled against a number of problems, in fact. In particular, my university was particularly strict in terms of ethical approvals. We wanted to interview witnesses to get some more sense of how people experience the riots and improve the model by adding some more realism based on the experience of those who had seen episodes who had been there. But the requirements are particularly strict, so we didn't really move on that with that idea. What I found very striking is that for a whole year after the riots, there's been no dedicated funding streams in the UK, and we have submitted a couple of proposals for general funding calls, but they were unsuccessful despite the topic, or perhaps because of the topic, I don't know. So our empirical study of the UK case stagnates at the moment, hasn't gone farther than what we did at the very beginning. I personally have undertaken more theoretical research on what would happen, and I'll say a word on that in a minute, what would happen in a network structure, and we are going to work on that from now on. Antonio has done some fieldwork in Greece about the protests there, so with the idea of doing a paper on the Greek case. So how would we have to adapt the model to represent what happened in a social reality that was completely different, of course, and with a problem that was different. So that's something that is, again, something to that is promising, because that would allow comparisons across countries. But it's coming. For now, we have the interviews done by Antonio, but that's all, no model. So in terms of the idea of working on a network, well, the idea that I had was that the original model was built on, with in mind, in fact, a geographical place, a spatial structure where agents would move around. But in fact, the use of social media, other than scanning physical spaces, could also be to communicate through something that can be represented through a network. And if we consider differences in network structure, if we consider different network positions of individuals, there may be differences and specificities that affect the way in which influences move around, the way in which people influence each other. So what will be the implications for censorship in this case? We have so far a first draft, a beta version of a model with some very, very, very preliminary results. So I'm just showing them. Antonio hasn't seen them yet, but so that's just to say, don't take them too literally. But in fact, the point, the first results indicate that when we have censorship, the network would be organized in a way, even starting from something very simple, the network would evolve in a way that limits connectivity. That is, you won't have very short paths. In fact, people would be connected locally, but not very well locally. So to reach, in practice, that would mean to reach one node from any other in the network, it would take quite a long while. And so you could have something like that. You have a relatively, and these are just some first simulations, so not completely tested, but you would have, again, with censorship, a high number of active agents, something that goes up at the beginning and stays high, which in fact is in a sense reassuring, because it confirms what we had seen already on the spatial representation of the model. Without censorship, in fact, the network can organize itself. I don't know if the image is very visible, but the network can organize itself in ways that are more complex. You can see still some peripheral groups, little connected to the others, but big hubs may emerge here and there to which other groups are connected. So some agents, in fact, might find themselves in positions where they can exert a lot of influence on others. And so the question is, what happens? So it seems that, yes, you have shorter paths. It seems that the number of active agents remains much lower on average and oscillates. So something that starts to resemble, even though we haven't tested all the parameter space yet, but something that moves in phases, so resembling, in fact, what we had seen already with punctuated equilibrium and phases of more or less intense activity, but on average, lower level of violence than with censorship. Sorry. So just to conclude, there are good news, as I said before, but the difficulty is more, as my experience indicates, the need to, how to manage to integrate a rapid response into a longer term research contribution, because you start something because you want to engage with a social event that needs social scientists to say something, to do something, but then you are completely uncertain about the future, about the funding, the availability of data, publication opportunities, perhaps even the research ethics. Given also that I think many of you, apart from simulation, but many of you use internet data or social media data, and research in this area in terms of ethics is often a gray area yet. So there are things that some ethical committee may authorize and some not at all, and you aren't necessarily sure in advance. So this is something I think that is perhaps the most challenging aspect of just-in-time approach as the one I have experienced and we have experienced. And yes, so I thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any comments for discussion.
Some questions? Yep, Tubaro.
Yeah, on the first model that you showed, not the last one on that.
Yeah.
How robust is the results that you find? I imagine you've changed many parameters, how many types of factors you have, and you always find the same.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So, in all honesty, we didn't do all the checks at the beginning, but we did them later, and fortunately, we were reassured that the results are robust. So, yes.
Oh, very interesting results, and
Thank you.
I would like to understand, how these results actually could be explained by the way the agent behaves. As you say that, if you have complete censorship, so then you will see a sudden rise in the number of active agents, and it stays up there. And I just wonder, how could it happen? Because if agent doesn't have a vision, and it doesn't see how many active agents are around, or and also the police around. So I presume that the agent will not make any switch from normal citizen to active activities. So in this case, there must be some assumption about the agent behavior that motivate the agent to switch.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's because, in fact, the decision to go active depends on two things. One's own feeling toward the social situation. We call it grievance, which would be how unhappy you are relative to the government, basically. And so that's something individual, and viewing others. And the point is that what happens without vision is that those who are very unhappy get active immediately, but then the number stays the same. That is, they don't influence any other agents to be, like those who would be borderline, for example, wouldn't go active, but they themselves would never get back to quiet, because they aren't influenced, they cannot be influenced by others who are quiet. So in fact, they turn active because they are unhappy at the beginning, and they stay like that all the time. And all the others start quiet and remain quiet.
But compared to the police agents, the police agents, they should be catching these active ones and reducing them.
They actually, so the first implementation we did was by giving the police the same vision power as normal agents, with the idea that, I mean, some have stressed the fact that the police, of course, have many more means than ordinary people, but that's all the CCTV cameras and the like. But there are two things. First, that requires a lot of time and effort to look around people and look at the videos and identify the people. Yes, it's doable, but that requires a lot of work on top of the recordings. And the police doesn't necessarily have all the resources to do that. They had some, actually, especially at the beginning in the UK riots, they had some difficulty in coping with the situation. And also we wanted a little bit more explicitly to represent the advantage that social media give to citizens in addition to the powers that the police normally has. So we wanted to stress that aspect rather than the police power aspect in the model. So, which is why we emphasized that rather than the control element. So that's why we chose this solution rather than representing the police as extremely powerful. In fact.
It's very interesting, and I think it's very rich to start to think about this kind of problem with this simulation. However, I have a slight question. What struck me is in the full censorship, nobody is in jail. That's quite bizarre to me, because in the full censorship, okay, you show that one of the slides, nobody is in jail. And one zero vision. Yes. And I thought that one of the reasons censorship, full censorship, is putting a lot of people in prison when they're not to confirm. So maybe there's some adaptation over there. And my question was about, you say about the people when they switch to become active, and you measure some kind of, give them some kind of level of grievance. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, recalling to what have been said about the riot, there were a lot of people doing it on opportunistic, because they were not depraved or jobless, but they were seeing that there is a shop which have been broken, and then they say, okay, they jump in. And there were many cases of people who should not have any grievance to society, but jump in the riot. And I was wondering how you can combine those dimensions with your model.
Yeah, that's so, yes, of course, you could tweak the model to get the police arrest some, even with full censorship. You just give them like a bit more vision than regular agents. You could say that if vision is 0 for all, then for the police it's at least 1, for example, and then you would get perhaps a more realistic result in this sense. I don't think the overall picture would change, but that would add this element, as you said. In terms of the other point, I think what accounts for the kind of behavior that you mentioned is primarily the social influences. So people who wouldn't become active by themselves, like here, those who become active, it's really their own choice, but afterward, in fact, you can also become active because others around you are, and maybe your own level of grievance wouldn't be enough to justify the starting of stealing in shops, but you see others doing that, and then you follow. So that's I would say the most interesting dynamic in the model.
It's a very interesting modeling. Only one thing, I have no experience with this, such high experience with this model of communication, of this modern communication. But in the situation of normal face-to-face communication, there are people who sometimes connect people from different surroundings. This is this idea of Mark Granovetter of strong ties and weak ties. But I didn't see in this model such different type of people. And maybe could improve a little bit the connectivity in your last models, that if we put into some 1%, 2% of people of different type who can connect, it could come to maybe some a little bit different results. I don't know if more realistic or not.
No, I entirely agree. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to test what happens if we implement the model on a network, because there you can account for. So at the moment, as I said, I have very preliminary results, not something more very stable, but that's the idea. Because at otherwise, I'm not sure how to do that in the original framework. So, but yes. That was,
another interesting direction would be, you're familiar with the space syntax approach of UCL. It's also an agent-based system that's about navigation based on vision and what's possible in the agent's vision, obstructions in the environment. So you can imagine in your simulation putting some environmental features, maybe targets, potential targets for riders or something like that, and to combine these two approaches could be interesting.
Yes, definitely. Interesting. I look at that.
And one small question. In one of the graphs here in the surrounding, you did have some active agents, and just some seconds before, very many of these quiet persons. That was this graph of yellow. Yeah, this one.
Yes,
this
one.
Yes.
Yes.
How can you explain, or how it is realistic that this qualitative switch of this very high percentage of quiet persons to very high percentage of active?
Yeah, that's I would say some sort of a specificity of this type of models that allow for these jumps, in a sense, once you get a threshold. So here you have something that like builds up very, very slowly and then suddenly moves so quickly. So it's really something that is observed in this kind of complex models, in fact, where you can have these sudden transitions from one state to another. So yeah, it's very common to observe in agent-based models because of no linearities, in fact, in the system. That's why.
Can I ask a second question? Sure. Is that based on the model, how could you judge, the amount of censorship has been imposed on the UK rights case? Is it possible to come up with a value?
With a
Data policy.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
For that particular instance.
Can you implement the actual policy in the model? That's what you.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well,
how would you give the UK rights a particular censorship score?
Yeah, of course. Then the recommendation is don't censor anything. Then it's more. I mean, you can have some issues with converting the parameters of the model. Here we have done 1 to 10. If you do that on a network, 1 to 10 makes no sense because distance 10 on a network is 3 times infinite, really. So it's enough to have much less to say there's no censorship, in fact. But in terms of the key recommendation we came out with immediately was Cameron. Stay there, don't do anything to social media, let them work as they should. So very, very, very simply, in fact. I think it would have been much more difficult if the answer would have been partial.
Yeah.
Partial where?
Yeah, I'm from
but
Singapore.
here it was sufficiently black and white.
So we don't see any rights, so it's hard to tell where
but
we
yeah,
stand.
perhaps, I mean, something that can be disturbing for some is that there's no situation in which you have no rioting, no nothing. But at the same time, I mean, and I think that's more Antonio's view that it's not necessarily that bad if you have some sign of activity, because that's also a way for citizens to express their unhappiness with their demands towards the government. So yes, the violence isn't ideal, to say the least, but some form of protest may not necessarily be bad.
A very quick one just before the pause. So it's interesting to see, I mean, one of the big advantages of these model is, and it was actually also stressed by Epstein and Axel since the beginning, is that it permits to structure the debate. I mean, you come with a model, it can be criticized, you say, there's one parameter that you underestimate, etc. And clearly, in an audience like this one, this is happening. You present, some people can go and check and maybe if they want to get involved, they propose an alternative model and then contradict your result, and then this becoming an in situ experimental science. Did you see that happening during outside this context? I mean, you published the result. Was this such kind of debate like the one we have today? Just after you published the result, or not?
Yes, and that was very, very helpful, by the way, because when we first, when we first came out with this blog post, we had done really a minimum, and what really helped to progress was the feedback we got from people, like with comments on our blogs or tweets, and even those who commented on their own blogs, then that gave us ideas on how to improve and how to make things better, incorporate some aspects. So that happened, and it was very reassuring.
But nobody made an alternative model based on your model of the day, because that's probably the steps where it starts really to be a kind of experimental science, not just criticism, but say, hey, I do not agree with the result of Paola Tubaro, and I made a different model with actually contradicting the result, and then we have a scientific argument. But we're not yet at that stage.
No,
If I might add something, probably it does have something to, it has something to do with the fact that this model was somehow a political intervention, let's put it into brackets. In a way, we wanted to position ourselves in a political debate that was dominated by this very simplistic gap between looters and heroes. And in a way, we told a different story. So far, this model has been a political tool to reaffirm some very basic democratic principle. Do not censor. Let the citizens have a well-informed behavior. From this point of view, it was just in time. In order to have somebody else to take the model, tweak it, or criticize it, now we have to allow time. This is where, just in time stops, and the regular time of social sciences kicks in, which is usually longer.
It could have been just in time too. I mean, you could have imagined someone in David Cameron's minister saying, oh, well, they actually did that, but hey, we have another version of it where actually we show that by tweaking a couple of parameters, censorship is a very good idea. And it would have been exciting to see that and see the model not just on ideology, but actually, but we're not yet at that.